struggling rancher bought a girl labeled too wild for any man, unaware she was born to ride beside him. The saloon. Doors banged open, and the stale air of dust and sweat thickened. Through the haze of tobacco smoke and the dim glow of lantern light, they saw her. A wild thing dragged into the center of the saloon floor. She couldn't have been more than 22. Her hair was tangled, her chin lifted high in defiance. Her wrists were bound tight with coarse rope, yet her back remained straight as a rifle barrel. She wore a faded work dress, boots scuffed by miles of dirt road, and her skin was streaked with dust. But it was her eyes that stopped the room. Fierce, unbroken, sparks trapped in storm clouds. "Name's Tessa," someone muttered. Hank McCord, bloated with whiskey and arrogance, lurched onto a table, his vest strained against his belly, his face slick with sweat and pride. Beer sloshed in the mug clutched in his hand. He jabbed a finger toward her, his voice splitting over the noise of the crowd. "This one don't know how to cook, nor bow her head, tongue sharper than a Bowie knife. Called me out in front of my own men." He spat the words like venom, his cheeks flushed red. "Any man wanna take a crack at taming her, go on. I'll sell her cheap. Ain't worth $1 to anyone who knows how to teach a woman her place." The saloon erupted in laughter. Tankards slammed against tables. Boots stomped the floorboards. A blacksmith with arms like hammers raised his glass and bellowed, "Wild mare, that one. Who's got the grit to break her?" Tessa's chest rose and fell, steady as a drumbeat. She stared straight at Hank, unblinking, her voice cutting through the raucous noise. "You're the one who can't teach nobody nothin', least of all yourself." The words cracked across the room like a whip. Hank froze. The grin slid off his face. He leapt down from the table, rage twisting his features, and with a drunken roar he struck her hard across the cheek. The blow sent her sprawling to the floor. Dust swirled in the lantern glow like mocking spirits. Blood streaked her lip, but she didn't cry out. She pushed herself up slowly, wiped the blood with her sleeve, and stood tall again, her eyes daring him to try once more. The laughter died. The room went still, not out of pity, out of anticipation. From a shadowed corner, a man rose. Bo Dillon. Tall, broad, his presence steady as a stone in a river. A crude splint bound his right leg, and a carved walking cane leaned against the bench where he had been sitting in silence. When he stood, the atmosphere shifted. Glasses hung in midair. Men shifted in their seats. Bo's voice was low, even. "How much?" Every eye turned to Hank. Hank, panting from the swing, sneered through a crooked grin. "You? A broken rancher with one good leg? Think she'll boil your beans, for she bores you to death." Bo didn't blink. He unfastened a worn leather pouch from his belt, poured a handful of silver coins onto the table. They clinked, rolled, and came to rest by Hank's dirty hand. "I'm not buying someone easy to own," Bo said. His voice was calm, but the words carried steel. "I want someone with fire." The room held its breath. Bo crouched, cut the rope from Tessa's wrists with a small knife, and helped her to her feet. His grip was steady but not forceful, his eyes locked with hers. He loft was little more than a crawl space above the main room, but to Tessa it felt like a fortress. Bo pointed to the wooden ladder without ceremony. "Bed's made. Clean towel by the basin," he said, his voice rough as gravel. Then he turned and walked out, leaving her alone with the sound of the wind pushing against the walls. That night she did not cry. She lay on the stiff mattress, staring up at the rafters, listening to the horses shifting in the barn. Strange roofs, cold floors, rough men, those were familiar to her. But this place was too quiet, too clean, suspicious. At dawn, before the sun had broken the ridge, she was already moving. She hauled water from the pump, stoked the stove, swept the porch boards until they shone with dust. No one had asked her to, but she had learned young. It was better to stay useful than to stay noticed. By the time Bo opened the door, limping toward the barn, she had a saddle balanced across the rail and water boiling for coffee. He stopped short, taking her in. Then, without comment, he dropped something on the porch rail. A pair of worn leather gloves, small enough for her hands. "Don't work like you're paying off a crime," he said, his tone softer than his words. "Work like you belong here." She took the gloves, her expression unreadable, but something in her eyes shifted. A crack. Just a hairline one, but it was there. That afternoon, as she chopped wood by the shed, she felt his gaze from the porch. He wasn't judging her swing. He was just watching. She brought him coffee by the fire that night. "Why?" he asked. "You paid for me," she answered with a shrug. His jaw tightened. "I paid to get you away from McCord, not to own you. Same thing to most folks. Not to me." The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was heavier, but warmer. Something alive. That night in the loft, Tessa listened again. Not for danger, but for him. The scrape of his chair by the fire. The groan of old timber in the wind. She did not trust him, not yet. But she no longer feared him. And that was new. The weeks unfolded quiet but steady. The wind swept across the ridge, sagebrush whispering against the fence lines. Tessa rode the property at dawn now, Bo's old trail hat pulled low, her frame straight as if she'd been born in the saddle. She checked posts, herded cattle, tossed feed with calm efficiency. Bo watched from the porch, cane balanced across his lap, saying little, noticing everything. One evening, with the sun bleeding low behind the hills, Bo carried a bucket toward the trough. His gait was slow, uneven, stubborn. Tessa was brushing down a young colt when she heard the fall. The thud of flesh against dirt. She spun. Bo was on the ground, cursing, his cane several feet away. She ran. "Don't move," he growled. "I'm not leaving you," she shot back, crouching. Sliding her arm under his shoulders, another around his waist, she pulled. "Come on. You're heavier than you look." "I look heavy," he rasped, but let her lift him. It was awkward, slow. Her chest pressed against his back as she half-dragged, half-carried him toward the house. Neither spoke, but both felt the line between necessity and something else waver and blur. On the steps, she shifted him too quickly. His leg struck the bench with a dull crack. He winced, biting down on pain. "Sorry," she murmured, eyes darting up to his, then away. "Not broken," he gritted out. "Just pride." She left him there, walking briskly into the house. He watched her shoulders, the determined tilt of her head, the gold caught in her hair by the last of the light. A surprised chuckle escaped him. "Cute," he muttered. The word felt strange in his mouth. He had never thought of Tessa that way before. The next morning, she found a folded note beside her plate. "Tessa, feed bins low. Check north fence." Her name. Not girl. Not you. Just Tessa. She touched the paper with her fingertips before tucking it into her apron pocket. That night, with the lantern burning low, she sat across from him by the fire. He poured her coffee, neither of them speaking for a while. Then her voice broke the quiet. "My parents were killed when I was 8. Bo looked at her, saying nothing. They were settlers. Too proud, too trusting. One night men came, said they wanted water. My father let them in." Her voice was flat, steel wrapped in silence. "I watched from under the floorboards. They burned the house, took what they wanted, left me to die." The fire snapped. She kept her eyes steady. "A stable hand found me days later. Thought I was a boy at first. Didn't matter. They put me to work. Hard work. Blood work. The kind that strips you of your name. I stopped crying that year. Decided if no one was going to protect me, I'd become the kind of girl no one could break." Bo's gaze met hers. Deep, still, not pitying, not soft. He simply nodded. For Tessa, that was enough. The last traces of winter clung stubborn to the northern hills, but the ground near the porch had begun to thaw. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. Somewhere inside that silence, something had shifted. Two people circling trust, circling belonging, not yet naming it, but no longer running from it either. She didn't smile, didn't thank him, but her gaze burned with something unspoken, recognition maybe, a shared refusal to bend. Without a word, Bo led her through the crowd. Men muttered, some scowled, but no one dared move against him. The swinging doors groaned as they stepped into the cool night. The wind caught the strands of Tessa's dark hair as she lifted her chin higher. She didn't look back. The saloon faded behind her like a bad dream. Bo followed, silent, lantern light steady at his side. He didn't try to tame her storm, he just walked beside it. And though she would never admit it aloud, Tessa felt a shift deep inside. Not gratitude, not surrender, something rarer. Choice. By the time the wagon creaked up the ridge, dusk had laid its quiet hand across the plains. Tessa sat stiff beside Bo, arms crossed, jaw tight. Rope no longer bound her, yet humiliation still clung to her like dust on her boots. She hadn't spoken a word since Red Hollow. She hadn't asked where they were going. The ranch came into view, a modest spread tucked against the horizon. Weathered fences, a sagging barn, a two-room house patched with care. No grandeur, no false promises, just something solid. Bo stopped the wagon, climbed down slow with the help of his cane, then turned to offer her a hand. She ignored it, jumped down on her own. Inside, the house smelled of cedar smoke and old leather. Tessa knelt beneath the porch steps, sleeves rolled to the elbow, fingers sinking into the cold soil. Each motion was deliberate, almost reverent, as though she were coaxing something unseen back into the world. Small roots, fragile seeds, placed with the care of someone rebuilding not just a garden, but a piece of herself. Bo rounded the corner with a bale of hay balanced over one shoulder. He stopped short when he saw her, a half-smile tugging at his mouth. "You planting potatoes down there?" His voice carried a note of surprise, easy and teasing. Tessa glanced up. A loose strand of hair had fallen across her cheek, streaked with dirt. She brushed it back with the back of her hand and shook her head. "Nope," she said. "Just flowers. Forget-me-nots. Maybe lavender daisies if they take." Bo raised a brow. "Figured you only grew what could fill a belly." Her smile came small but real. "Flowers'll grow on stone if you water 'em enough. I don't need much. Just a patch of ground that ain't trying to spit me out." He didn't answer right away. He only stood there, silent, watching her. There was something in her tone. Not hope exactly, not bitterness either. It was quieter than both. Persistent, like the flowers she pressed into the earth. "My mother," Tessa murmured, brushing the dirt from her palms. "She loved planting. Used to say every flower was a letter from the earth. After she died and I got taken, I never had ground of my own again. Never stayed anywhere long enough to grow anything." She pushed against her knees and rose to her feet. "Until now, I guess." Bo gave a slow nod, no words to offer. He turned back toward the house, but the weight of what she'd said lingered between them that evening. When Tessa came in from watering the rosebush, she found a small bundle laid in the center of the kitchen table, wrapped carefully in a linen napkin. She unfolded it with cautious fingers. Inside was an envelope, paper yellowed with age, edges fragile as old lace. The ink had faded, but one word still held: seeds. She looked up just as Bo came through the door, hanging his hat on the peg. "These yours?" she asked softly. Bo's gaze fell on the packet. His voice was quieter than usual. "They were my mother's. She saved seeds every spring. Said one day she'd plant them when the house was right." Tessa's fingers curled gently around the envelope. "Why give them to me?" He studied her with that steady, unreadable look she had come to know. Finally, he said, "Because maybe the house is right now. Or maybe it just needed someone who knew what flowers were worth." Tessa didn't answer. She only pressed the fragile bundle to her chest, as though shielding it. That night, no more was said, but something had shifted between them. A warmth that wasn't from the fire, a wordless promise. In a place where nothing had grown before, something had quietly begun to bloom. The wind rose out of the south the next morning, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and the sharp tang of dust. Bo was out by the barn, splitting wood, when he saw the figure riding up the main path. The rider was no ranch hand. His suit was a shade of gray too fine for these hills, his black boots polished to a shine. A bowler hat shadowed a clean-shaven face, smug and practiced. He dismounted with the kind of confidence that came from men who thought land and people could both be owned, then walked toward the porch with a satchel in hand. Bo set his axe aside and straightened, leaning heavy on his cane as he limped forward. "You Bo Dillon?" the man called, voice carrying sharp as a blade. Bo's grip tightened on the cane. "Who's asking?" The stranger's smile spread thin, never touching his eyes. "Thomas Whitfield, First Land and Title Bank out of Cheyenne. Just here to verify some land holdings. Routine check." The lantern flickered low in the kitchen, its glow softening the edges of the worn cabin walls. Shadows danced across the table where two figures sat, the silence between them no longer heavy but quietly alive. Outside, the Wyoming wind swept over the tall grass, sighing against the shutters like an old song. But inside, there was warmth. Not just from the stove, but from the steady presence of two people who had begun, almost without realizing it, to build something together. Tessa leaned over the ranch ledger, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hand moving quickly and with purpose. The pencil scratched across the page as she tallied feed costs, repairs, and every purchase down to the last nail. Her brow furrowed in concentration, a faint smudge of graphite streaking her cheek where she had brushed her face with the back of her hand. Her hair, usually wild, was caught in a loose braid, though strands had slipped free to frame her face. Across from her sat Bo Dillon, shoulders broad, posture relaxed in the way of a man more at home with silence than with words. A branding guide lay open before him, the leather cover scarred and creased from years of use. He traced a finger over the faded symbols burned into the page, speaking low and steady, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "This one here," he said, tapping a mark with the edge of his thumb. "Bar T, belonged to a ranch south of Casper. Been gone near 10 years now. Drought took him out." Tessa glanced up, the corners of her mouth tugging in a faint smile. "And this one?" she asked, pointing at a crooked line with two wings on either side. Bo's eyes softened. "That was my father's first brand. Before the herd grew. He burned it into every fence post on this place with his own hands. Said it was a reminder. Land don't keep itself." Tessa let the pencil rest, studying him. The firelight caught the lines in his face, the rough-hewn strength of him. For the first time she realized how much of his life was written not in ledgers or deeds, but in scars, brands, and memory. "You remember all of them," she said quietly. Bo nodded once. "Every one. Brands tell a story. Who built, who lost, who held on. They're more than marks on a hide. They're blood and sweat carved into history." The words settled between them, rich and unhurried. Tessa lowered her gaze back to the ledger but found her mind lingering on him. On the way his hands, scarred and strong, handled the branding book with the same care she had once seen him give a wounded colt. After a moment, she spoke, her voice softer. "And what story does this place tell?" Bo leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting to the window where the night stretched wide and endless. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "That we're still standing." The quiet that followed was not empty. It was full of trust unspoken, of gratitude not yet named, of something fragile growing roots where neither had thought it possible. Tessa set down her pencil, flexing her fingers. "Standing's a start," she murmured. "But I'd say this place is beginning to breathe again." Bo's gaze returned to her, and for just a second the unreadable shield he always carried seemed to falter. There was something else there, something softer, almost startled by its own existence. He reached across the table, not to touch her, but to set the branding book closer, its edge brushing the ledger she had been working on. "Then maybe," he said slowly, "it's worth writing down in both ledgers." Her eyes lingered on his, caught by the weight of what he hadn't quite said. She nodded once, her throat tight, and picked up the pencil again. Outside, the wind carried the smell of sage and dust. Inside, the lantern glowed steady, casting its light on two people who had been broken in different ways, yet were learning, carefully, quietly, that some stories could be rewritten. "Well," he said, smiling in that slow, careful way of his, "then let me be the first to say it without raising my voice." Tessa tilted her head, watching him, the corners of her lips still curved. Something unspoken settled between them, fragile yet steady, like a fence post driven deep enough to hold against the wind. She set the ledger aside, her fingers brushing against the worn wood of the table as if she were anchoring herself. "It sounds different coming from you," she admitted. Bo studied her face, the faint pink still on her cheeks, the way her braid had loosened from the long day's work. "Good different?" he asked, his tone lighter than before but his eyes intent. She hesitated, then nodded. "Good different." The lantern flame flickered low, throwing shadows that stretched across the walls. For a moment, neither of them reached for the kettle or spoke of the chores waiting at first light. They simply sat, two people whose lives had been nothing but labor and loss, sharing a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like a beginning. Outside, the Wyoming wind swept through the grass, but inside, in the small circle of golden light, Tess realized she couldn't remember the last time she had felt seen, truly seen. Bo leaned back slightly, his smile fading into something softer, steadier. "Then Tess it is," he said, almost like a promise. "The prairie lies hushed beneath a gray sky. Dew clings to the grass like 1,000 tiny pearls, each one trembling against the restless breeze. Tessa sits on a flat rock by the creek, her satchel at her feet. The folded note she left behind burns in her mind like a brand. Thank you for letting me survive." For words, for walls, a cage of her own making. The water moves glass smooth over the stones. She stares at it until her reflection blurs. Her breath is steady, her eyes dry, but inside each step she's taken has left an echo heavier than the last. The sound of hooves cuts through the stillness. Her head doesn't turn, but her whole body tenses. She knows the cadence, knows the weight in that gait. At the ridge above, Bo's horse slows to a halt. The broad silhouette against the pale morning, unmistakable. He dismounts carefully, his left knee stiff as always, his boot hitting the earth with a dull, grounded thud. For a long moment he simply stands there watching her. Then, slowly, deliberately, he walks down the slope toward her. Tessa doesn't move, arms folded over her knees, gaze fixed on the current. She keeps herself still, bracing like she's facing down a storm. When he's close enough to see the furrow between her brows, his voice breaks the silence. Low, steady, but carrying more weight than the wind itself. "You left before breakfast." Tessa doesn't answer. His eyes drop to the satchel, then to the empty space beside her. The raw silence between them stretches taut, threatening to snap. Quiet, but sharp. "You think I brought you here to muck stalls?" That makes her lift her head, finally meeting his eyes. "Tessa, I don't think anyone hires someone like me for anything else." Her voice is calm, but there's steel under it. "Tessa, I was trouble when I came, a burden when I stayed. Beat, I just thought maybe it was time to stop pretending." For a long second, Bo just looks at her, not blinking, not flinching. Then he steps closer, enough that his shadow brushes the edge of the rock where she sits. "Bio, pretending what?" Tessa swallows, looks back at the water. Her reflection wavers. "Tessa, that this was more than work, more than a roof." Beat, softer, more than survival. Her words land like stones dropped into the creek, ripples widening between them. Bo exhales, slow, controlled. But there's heat beneath it. "Bio, Tess, you think survival's all I saw in you?" She doesn't answer. He crouches, knee stiff, but steady. His face lowers closer to hers, his voice dropping to something rawer. "Bio, I've seen men who only know how to take. I've seen women who never got the chance to stand. But you, Beat, you came here carrying fire. and you put it into every damn thing you touched. Tessa's jaw tightens, her eyes shining now though no tears fall. Tessa. Fire burns things down. Bio. Yeah. But it also keeps people alive. Their gazes lock. Neither looks away this time. The creek rushes on, indifferent. Birds wheel overhead. The wind sighs through the grass. For the first time in years, Tessa doesn't feel like running. He nodded, voice low, almost reverent. And you were right. Took root where most would have withered. Made something living out of stone and ash. Tessa tilted her head, studying him, the last of the sunlight catching on his jaw. And what are you saying, Bo? He reached into his pocket, not fumbling, not rushed, just sure. Pulled out a small strip of leather, worn soft, looped around a silver ring. It wasn't polished or fine, but it gleamed like it belonged in her hand. I'm saying I don't want to just ride beside you today, or tomorrow. I want to build the rest with you. Fences, fires, mornings, storms, whatever comes. The air stilled. Tessa's breath caught, her fingers brushing the ring where it dangled between them. Bo! Her voice was soft, nearly breaking. I ain't a woman who was raised for promises. His eyes didn't move from hers. Neither was I. But maybe that's why we know how to keep them. The silence stretched, not heavy this time but full, like the sky holding its breath. Then, slowly, Tessa took the leather cord, slid the ring free, and slipped it onto her finger. Her hand shook. Her smile didn't. You're a fool, she whispered, though her eyes shone bright. Maybe, he said, grinning faintly, but I'm your fool. And with the wildflowers swaying around them, roots stubborn in the rocky earth, she leaned in and kissed him. Not like a goodbye, not like a question, but like a beginning. The weeks that followed seemed touched by something larger than weather or luck. Word spread quiet in town, like whispers carried on the wind, that Bo Carter and the woman once called Trouble were to be bound in matrimony. No invitations were printed, no announcements nailed to posts. Yet when the morning came, neighbors, ranch hands, and townsfolk found their way to the ridge. It was the same hill Tessa had sown with wildflowers, the same ground where Bo had placed the ring on her finger. Now it bloomed in riotous color, a natural chapel beneath the open sky. The preacher stood with his book, its pages fluttering in the soft breeze, while the congregation gathered in a wide half-circle, hats in hands, boots rooted firm in the soil. The air smelled of sage and sun-warmed blossoms. Tessa wore no silk, no lace. Her dress was simple cotton, hem-stitched by her own hand, a sprig of lavender tucked behind her ear. Her boots were dusted from the walk up the ridge, but her eyes were steady, lit with something the past could not darken. Bo stood waiting, hair trimmed rough, coat pressed as best as one man could manage. He had polished his boots until the leather caught the sun, though a scuff or two still lingered. He looked at her the way a man looks at the only horizon worth chasing. When she reached him, she did not lower her gaze, did not fold her hands like the brides she had once seen in passing. She stood shoulder square, equal, unflinching. The preacher cleared his throat, voice carrying across the ridge. We stand on this land where roots grow deep through stone, where blooms rise through dust, to witness the joining of two souls who have chosen each other freely. Bo reached for her hand. She gave it without hesitation. I don't have a vow polished or pretty, he said, voice low but strong. But I'll tell you plain. I'll rise beside you every morning, work the land beside you every day, and face the storm beside you every night. That's my word. Tessa's lips trembled, though she did not look away. I've run from many things in my life, she said softly. But not you. Never you. You gave me a place when I thought I deserved none. So I'll give you what I never thought I could, my roots, my fight, and the rest of my days. The preacher smiled, lines creasing deep around his eyes. Then by witness of these hills, these flowers, and these good folk, I declare you bound, not by rope, not by law alone, but by choice. May you walk as one. There was no grand cheer, no music save the wind in the flowers. But as Bo bent and kissed her, the ridge seemed to hum with approval, like the earth itself had been waiting for this moment. Later, The people drifted back down to the ranch where long tables had been set with bread, roasted meat, and cider. Children chased each other between barrels, fiddles struck up tunes, and laughter rose into the dusk. Tessa danced barefoot in the dirt, skirt spinning, Bo's hands steady at her waist. For once, she was not running. She was not surviving. She was home. Seasons turned over the ridge like pages in a book. The wildflowers still rose each spring, a living witness to that day they made their vows. By the time the third summer came, the ranch was no longer just Bo's spread. Folks in town called it Carter Ridge, though most everyone knew it was Tessa who rode the lines at dawn, kept the books balanced, and carried the brand in her steady hand. Children's laughter soon echoed through the fields. Their firstborn, a boy with Bo's calm eyes and Tessa's stubborn jaw, learned to walk among the garden rows where bees hummed. A daughter followed, wild and unshaken, who climbed fences before she could spell her own name. They grew sun-browned and sure-footed, raised on chores and stories by firelight. Life was not gentle, not always. Winters pressed hard, storms split fences, cattle sickened, and once a wildfire rolled across the hills, forcing them to fight with buckets and prayers through a choking night. But where others broke, they bent together. Where others lost faith, they leaned heavier into each other's steadiness. In town, whispers shifted. She was no longer the woman sold for a sack of corn, but Mrs. Carter, the one who taught half the boys to ride straighter, the one who stood shoulder to shoulder with her husband at every fair, every town vote, every hard season. Bo remained quiet, never one to boast, but his gaze always gave him away, the way it followed her like a compass never losing true north. Years stretched, silver threaded through Bo's beard, and fine lines gathered around Tessa's eyes. Yet each morning she still pressed a steaming tin cup into his hand before sunrise, and each evening he still found her fingers under the table, twining with his when no one was looking. And on every anniversary of their vows, they returned to the ridge. Sometimes with children trailing behind, sometimes alone, but always with hands clasped the way they had on that first day. One autumn, as the fields turned gold and the sky deepened to cobalt, their daughter, nearly grown, asked her mother why they always came back. Tessa looked out over the land, the fences, the barn, the wildflowers swaying against the stone. She did not answer right away. Instead, she reached for Bo's hand, rough as ever, steady as always. Because, she said finally, her voice soft but unshaken, this is where I stopped surviving and started living. The wind carried her words across the ridge, weaving them into the roots, the rocks, the blossoms that would bloom long after they were gone. And so the land kept their story, not a tale of saints or heroes, but of two people who chose each other again and again, until choosing became the very shape of their lives. He was no longer just helping Bo. She was running the ranch with him. They never made announcements, never needed to, but the way she walked beside him at the general store hand-brushing, the way he passed her tools without asking, the way she handed him coffee, every sunrise with the quiet smile of someone who had made peace with herself. It was all clear as glass. On one warm evening with crickets chirping and the sun hanging low like a coin in the west, he saddled his horse and whistled for her. She met him outside the barn, curious. You planning on running off? Only if you're coming too, she arched a brow. Where we headed, you'll see. They rode side by side, hoofs kicking up, soft clouds of dirt. The trail wound past the southern field over the small ridge where wildflowers bloomed, thickest in spring. It had been Tessa's idea to scatter seed there. The soil was rocky, the hill half barren, but she said it deserved something beautiful. Now in the golden light of dusk, that hill was ablaze with color. Bull dismounted and tied his horse. She followed suit. Together they climbed the last slope on foot, boots crushing wild petals. At the top they stood in silence. The flowers brushed their knees. Wind moved through them like a hymn. In the distance the ranch lay, quiet and golden, safe under their shared care. Bo cleared his throat. You said something once about how flowers can grow on rock. Tessa turned curious. I did. He looked at her steady and calm. Got me thinking. If flowers can grow on stone, maybe love can too. She didn't speak, just watched him. Every wall inside her trembling but not falling. Bo took a slow breath. Where does it grow? Tess, love. She blinked, then smiled softly. A smile full of everything she had been and everything she had become. In people, she said, who ain't afraid of where they came from, even when it hurt. His eyes dropped for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket. From it he pulled a piece of leather, worn, curved with age. It was the old horse rein he had carried since boyhood, the first one he'd ever carved, and in the center a single letter burned into it. T. I ain't got a ring, he said. Never figured I'd need one. He stepped closer and held it out. But this has followed me longer than any man or woman, through war, through storms. The only thing I ever trusted to hold steady. Tessa stared at the strip of leather. Her throat tightened. I wanted to follow you now, Bo said. If you'll let it. She didn't answer right away, just reached out, her callous sunbread fingers brushing his. She took the leather, looped it gently around her wrist, then met his eyes. You didn't try to tame me, she whispered. No, he said. You're not a thing to be tamed. You just stood beside me. He nodded. That's the only way I want it. He said. Beside you always. They stood, like that long after the sun dipped. Behind the ridge. No vows, no preacher. Just flowers, wind, and two souls who had stopped running. From that day forward, folks didn't call it Dillon Ranch anymore. They called it Wildflower Ridge. Not just for the blooms, but for the woman who made them grow. Tessa rode beside me every day after, through storm, through sun, through every broken fence, and every birth in the barn. And when strangers came and asked who ran the place, the townsfolk would say, she does. The girl no man could keep, but someone did. No, they'd reply, smiling. Someone chose her, and she chose him back. If that story touched your heart, if you felt the dust in the wind, the fire in her eyes, and the quiet strength of a man who chose not to tame, but to stand beside, then you're in the right place. We bring you tales of love that rise from the hardest ground, stories where hearts heal, where strong women and silent men find something worth holding on to, and where even the wildest souls find home. So, if you believe in that kind of love, the kind you fight for, the kind you ride beside, hit that subscribe button, like, and share this story with someone who still believes in real raw romance. And remember, out here in the West, love was never tame.